Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the official U.S. launch of Examining the Crude Details, Government Audits of Oil and Gas Projects to Maximize Revenue Collection. I'm Daniel Muley. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Tax and Extractive Industries with Oxfam America. And I'm happy to be here with you today to, despite the rain, to talk about the exciting subject of petroleum cost auditing. So thank you for braving the elements today. I'll start by just sharing a little bit of background about why Oxfam is interested in this topic. And then I'll quickly pass the podium to Alexandra Reedhead, who's the lead author on this report and an expert on transfer pricing and tax in extractives. And then we'll have a panel discussion to follow that, facilitated by our moderator, Oxfam Vice President Fatima Sumar, and joined by three exciting panelists, Humberto Campodonico from Peru, Charles Wanguhu, who's joining us from Kenya, and Thomas Bomsgaard, who's coming to us from the not-so-distant Washington offices of the IMF. We'll then open the discussion to a questions and answer session for those of you who are here in the room, as well as the folks we have joining by phone and on the live stream via WebEx. And we'll also have some refreshments during the Q&A time, just set up right outside. So please feel free to step out, grab some food or drink, and come back in if you'd like to continue to partake in that discussion. So enough about logistics. Why does Oxfam care about auditing in the oil and gas sector? For those of you who don't know Oxfam is an international organization dedicated to fighting inequality and addressing the injustice of poverty. And we feel that oil, gas, and mining sectors, if effectively taxed and regulated, can also provide resource-rich countries with critical domestic revenues to address poverty and inequality. Thank you. Unfortunately, many resource-rich countries in the global south don't always fare so well in being able to do just that, and end up faring particularly poorly in terms of income inequality, one dimension of what is called the resource curse. Further, communities affected by mining oil and gas projects, and particularly women and girls, often aren't able to reap the benefits of natural resource extraction. But in most countries, subsoil resources are actually held by the state in trust for the public, and that particularly means that these resources are for the public benefit. For Oxfam, our interest in what is in the soil, or what is under the soil, is directly related to the people who live above it and have a claim to benefit from natural resource extraction. So I won't say too much about Oxfam and our work, but you should know that Oxfam has stressed that citizens and communities have a right to know about extractive projects and their terms, and the right to decide about whether these projects should proceed. We've stressed that for over 20 years with our Extractive Industries Global Program, and that's in part because we recognize the outsized impact that these industries particularly have on resource-rich countries in the global south. Oxfam has focused on revenues in particular with the goal of, because they are a key way in which communities can benefit and citizens can benefit from natural resource extraction. So we look at tax revenues as a key opportunity, even though we look at, and that requires us to look all across the extractive industry's value chain. On the tax side of things, though, it's particularly important that we consider this third step in the EI value chain, the collection of taxes and royalties, and that we address both tax policy issues and tax avoidance issues. Tax policy issues and tax administration issues. And that's in part because we recognize that oftentimes the contracts or the laws that establish a fiscal regime are already set. And in order to improve the benefits that communities and citizens can take and can reap from these sort of projects, we do also have to ensure that revenue collection is maximized, and that includes addressing corporate tax avoidance. So corporate tax avoidance, economist Gabriel Zucman has estimated that countries around the world are losing $130 billion per year to legal tax avoidance. And as Alexandra will explain in just a moment, the oil and gas sectors are at particular risk. The key, really, that's motivated our interest in this study is to make sure that governments are empowered to be able to combat that tax avoidance. And if not, governments end up leaving money on the table. And so if we're to summarize what this issue is about, from Oxfam's perspective in just one line, it's about making sure that governments are empowered enough to not leave that money on the table. And Alexandra will come and speak to you now just to provide a more detail about how we can ensure that that happens.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much to Oxfam for having me here today. As Dana said, my name is Alexandra Reedhead, and I have the privilege of authoring the report that we're here to share with you today, along with Daniel and our other colleagues as well, Anton October in particular. So I have 18 minutes to talk you through this report. I have a stopwatch here and Isabel in front of me, so I'll definitely be kept to time, I think. As Daniel said, this is what we're focusing on today is a narrow but important issue of government cost auditing in the oil and gas sector. So the study that we're here to launch was guided by two questions, which you can see on the screen in front of you. Are governments making effective use of their audit rights? Are they actually auditing oil and gas projects? And if not, what are the challenges to doing so, and how might we overcome those challenges? So those were the two questions that we were looking at in our research. And I think the answers to these questions are particularly important for policymakers in resource-rich countries that are focused on improving revenue collection, but also for civil society advocates and other oversight actors who are interested, as you said, Daniel, in maximising the benefits and reaping the rewards from their natural resources. The methodology, very briefly, was obviously to do a desk-based review. One of the challenges that we encountered that there is no standard for petroleum cost auditing. There are obviously audit standards more generally, but nothing particular to the oil and gas sector, which we think, of course, underscores the importance of this research, that we need to look in more detail at what indeed the standard should be and what is involved in terms of auditing and resource revenue administration more generally. We did field research in 3 countries. They were chosen for a number of different reasons. Those are Ghana, Kenya, and Peru. One of the challenges that we face in our research is the lack of publicly available data on audits themselves. So it's very difficult to determine the effectiveness of cost audits from a quantitative perspective. So to decide, how much a government's collecting from cost auditing, what is the gap, what are the issues. It's difficult to do that from a quantitative point of view, but there's certainly substantial qualitative evidence to suggest that governments could be using their petroleum cost auditing rights more effectively, nonetheless. So what is petroleum cost auditing? So petroleum cost auditing, there's a number of different stages involved that you can see in very tiny print on the screen, so don't worry. The main takeaway really is that audit is the process of verifying the accounts and the records of taxpayers to determine the amount of revenue due to government. And obviously there's going to be a number of stages involved in doing that, but it's really about looking at the records of taxpayers and verifying those records and determining how much revenue is due to government subsequent to that. So that's what a cost audit is. Now, what does cost auditing mean in the oil and gas sector specifically? Well, that really depends on the type of fiscal regime that you have for your oil and gas sector, which varies from country to country. In practice, the audit itself remains the same, but the substance of the audit, who's responsible for the audit, all of these things may vary depending on the type of fiscal regime. So we know that for most of you, I assume, familiar with the sector, we commonly have a production sharing regime or a tax and royalty regime. Under a production sharing regime, you're going to have a cost recovery audit, which is really auditing, monitoring cost recovery to ensure that the company does not overstate the costs so as to dilute the government's share of profit oil. Because you have a sharing of the physical production and the company takes a certain amount of production to recover its costs, and what is left over is then shared between government and the investor according to some formula. So the question, the all-important question for government is what's left over the right amount, and are the costs inflated with respect to cost recovery? On the tax side of things, if you have a tax and royalty regime, same sort of questions, but the impact and the risk there is to income tax. So are the costs being overstated such that government is collecting less income tax as a result? And then, of course, you have this kind of little bit in the middle, the hybrid, which is we perhaps ignore it a little bit too much, but certainly in many countries you have a hybrid fiscal regime where you have both production sharing and taxes and possibly royalties as well, which creates a lot of additional complexity in terms of the type of audit that's being carried out, who is carrying out the audit, the time frame for those respective audits, and so forth. So in the three countries that we looked at, Peru operates a tax and royalty regime. Kenya operates a production sharing regime, but is moving to including corporate income tax as well. And Ghana also has tax and royalty, but it also takes a share of production in the form of an additional oil entitlement. So there's always lots of different variations from country to country. So why does cost auditing matter? So why are we all here? Why are we braving the elements to talk about cost auditing, despite the fact it's very interesting? So it matters for we think it matters for three reasons. So the first is that the costs that are deducted by oil and gas companies are large, both in absolute terms and relative to gross revenues. So you can see on the screen here, this is data from Wood Mackenzie. So the capital and operating costs of all oil and gas projects in our three case study countries amounted to around 43 to 49% of gross petroleum revenues between 2008 and 2017. So this means that for every $1 of revenue a company makes, at least 40 cents is spent on costs. So consequently, even a very slight overstatement of costs is going to have a very significant impact on government revenues. So that's the first point. These costs are very big. The second point is around opportunities for tax avoidance. So as Daniel said, features of the oil and gas sector combined with the international tax system offer opportunities for companies to avoid taxes. The example on the slide in front of you relates to transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is a legitimate business practice. It's the process for determining the price of a transaction between two related parties within the same corporate group. The issue is where companies use that opportunity to distort the price so as to shift profits from high-tax countries to low-tax countries to reduce their global tax bill. So the example on the screen relates to the provision of technical services by an affiliate in a low-tax country. Those services are being provided to the oil project in the host country, and those services are the price is being marked up. It's above market price for those services as a means of stripping profit out of the project and hence paying less tax to the tax administration. The third reason is the significant revenues at stake. So as I mentioned earlier, the lack of transparency around audit results does make it very difficult to determine the quantitative impact of actually carrying out audits. But anecdotal evidence suggests that the revenues at stake are significant. So you can see the examples on the screen. The case of Chevron in Australia, which is where I come from, a big case relating to its debt finance arrangements with its affiliate in Delaware. In Ghana, a transfer pricing case relating to a company called Sinopec with respect to the cost of a gas processing plant. And then lastly, in the Republic of Congo. Now this one is an interesting case because the only reason we know about the results from the Republic of Congo is that the donors requested that the government carry out and publish the results from independent audits of 9 oil permits belonging to Total and Eni. So this is an interesting example of where transparency is brought to bear on the audit process, and as a result we can see more clearly what the impact of that audit was. Of course then the question is that the right amount or not, and that requires closer investigation. But having that information in the public domain is important nonetheless. So these are the three reasons why we think cost auditing matters. The costs are significant, the opportunities for tax avoidance are also considerable, and finally, the revenues at stake. So the all-important question, are governments actually auditing costs? So given what we know about the risk and why cost auditing matters, what are governments actually doing about it? So as I said earlier, one of the challenges is that none of the three case study countries discloses information which citizens can use to comprehensively judge the use of auditing rights on the part of government. So the table on the screen is limited and highlights what we know to be the number of audits that have been conducted in each of the three case study countries. You can see there's a big question mark around Peru, as there is very little information available there at all. So the evidence suggests that there's mixed results with respect to governments actually using their cost audit rights. So then what are the challenges? I said at the beginning that two of our questions were, are governments actually auditing costs, and if not, why, and what are the challenges? And so we find that yes, they are auditing costs in general, not always as timely as they should, and there are lots of questions around whether they have the requisite capacity and expertise to be able to verify those costs, but nonetheless audits are happening. But there are challenges, and as you can see on the screen and in the report, we highlighted 6 of these challenges. And the first one relates to legal controls. So, of course, the right to audit costs is necessary, but not sufficient to control costs. If the law has gaps or loopholes, or if there's a stability clause, for example, that prevents the fiscal terms in the contract from being updated, then companies might be able to claim costs that the auditor has no legal basis to correct. So an auditor is only as effective as the legal framework which he or she has to enforce. So we identify in the report a number of legal constraints relating to measures that control perhaps the timing and the amount of costs, as well as I said, limits to changes with respect to which costs are eligible for deduction or not. So the issue highlighted on the slide relates to ring fencing. So we've just chosen one of the issues that we identified in the research, and the ring fencing issue comes up in Ghana. Initially, the ring fencing rule in Ghana was applied on a contract-by-contract basis. So you can see here that if you've got 2 contract areas that are demarcated by this white dotted line, that costs cannot be consolidated between those contract areas. And the reason for that might be to bring forward revenue, government revenue. So it's a timing issue. It's not to say that you won't get the revenue, but by not allowing the cost to be consolidated, you bring revenues forward. So they had ring-fenced on a contract-by-contract basis. However, the issue was, you can see in oil field B, where you have a couple of oil fields within the same contract area. Now, those oil fields may be at different stages of production, and so what they found was that the company was offsetting the costs of the development of the new field against the income of the field that was already in production. And so that meant that, again, revenue was deferred, and in this case, that was $50 million. So in this instance, the auditors, despite identifying this issue, had no power to correct this because of the deficiency in the law, which was that rather than ring fencing on a field-by-field basis, it was ring fenced on a contract-by-contract basis. Now, this has subsequently been amended in Ghana, but these are the kinds of challenges that auditors are up against in terms of actually being able to do their job. The second issue is around difficulties accessing taxpayer information. So one of the challenges for tax administrations and government more generally is actually dealing with these costs, actually having the information to be able to benchmark and to verify whether these costs are appropriate or whether they're too high. That can be a real challenge, especially for frontier countries that are dealing with these costs for the first time, that have no idea whether it's appropriate or not. And then, of course, the cost of procuring such data, whether it's in the form of a commercial database, can sometimes be prohibitive for governments. But there is some progress, and we highlighted 2 initiatives on the screen. The first one is not so much an initiative, but in Peru, the regulatory agency, Peru Petros, found that competitive public bid rounds for oil blocks can be a useful way to increase the available benchmark data. So they commission studies before they launch a bid, And in that study, there'll be information on the development and operating costs of the block. And then the companies that bid are also required to provide information on their operations elsewhere to give the government an idea of what it will cost them to develop the field. So all of this is quite useful information that if consolidated and collected by government can be helpful in future in terms of verifying those costs, to have something to kind of benchmark against, even though of course those costs may change over time, but it gives you at least something to start with. The second is an initiative supported by Chatham House and the Commonwealth Secretariat, the new Petroleum-producers Group, which is building a platform for governments to upload and share anonymised cost data from oil and gas taxpayers from a number of countries. So again, trying to get around the challenge of purchasing a subscription to an expensive database, maybe to see how governments can actually share the information that they collect more effectively to increase that pool of information. The third issue is, and challenge is, often audits are too late. So as you can see here on the screen, this is a very simple version of the value chain from exploration through to production. Now the point is that oil companies start incurring costs from exploration. So if those costs are eligible, they will later be recovered, they'll be cost recoverable, and they may be tax deductible as well. So the challenge is making sure that the government starts auditing sooner rather than later. So if they don't look at these costs, then it may be that the time period expires. So you can see again here that often you find that governments wait to audit costs until revenues start to flow, until production starts, and the government starts to collect revenue. It's only then that they begin to look back at the costs that have been incurred up till that point. And as I said, it may be that at that point these are outside the audit time limit and record keeping requirements may have run out. So the example in Kenya is with the Tullow oil project. That project has started exploration in 2008. It will start first oil, started first oil last year. Now, the issue is that in Kenya, the cost recovery audit period is only 2 years. And it's only now that the first cost recovery audit is beginning. So technically, the government is only able to look back 2 years, despite the fact that $1.8 billion worth of cost has been incurred up until this point. And so that's a real issue. Now, Tullow has said it's okay, we'll let you look back further than that. But let's see what the audit finds out and how comfortable they are with that going forward, because they're well within their rights to say any adjustments before this 2 year period are not, we won't accept them because it's deemed to be correct based on the law. Right. The next challenge is around cost audit rights. Audit rights are fragmented. So, the fragmentation of revenue administration is one of the biggest challenges to effective cost auditing, and not just cost auditing, more generally revenue collection in this sector. Often responsibilities are widely dispersed. There's not a lot of exchange of information and expertise between these agencies. I want to highlight in particular the role of national oil companies. So in Ghana, for example, the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation actively participates in joint venture audits as a partner in a number of joint ventures in Ghana. It has the industry expertise and the insights into commercial operations, but it's not engaged at all with the Ghana Revenue Authority. There is no sharing of information and expertise, and the Ghana Revenue Authority doesn't ask for the joint venture audit reports either. And then the role of supreme audit institutions. So in Kenya, for example, the Office of the Auditor General indicates that it has a role to play because it's dealing with public expenditures in the case of cost recovery. Now, of course, oversight is a very important thing. It's very important that the Office of the Auditor General is involved in overseeing the audit functions of other government agencies, but it itself is perhaps not well placed to actually be directly involved in revenue collection. There have been efforts in countries to improve coordination. The example on the screen is from Ghana, where you have the multi-agency Petroleum Revenue Committee. You can see the various institutions that are involved in that, and I think that's been very effective so far in dealing with particular issues like payments for land use and sharing information. But I think there's a question mark about the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation not being involved in that committee. Often the corporations are kept at arm's length. But so there have been efforts in some countries to improve coordination, and that's certainly something that's very important particularly in terms of improving, building expertise and increasing the availability of information for tax administrations in particular to do their jobs effectively. Audit capacity may be limited. That won't be a surprise to anyone, but in a number of these countries, not only the number of auditors is perhaps less than we would like to see. So the example there being from Peru, where you have 56 oil and gas taxpayers and only 5 auditors. So that's quite a large caseload for those auditors to deal with. And then similarly, just not having the industry expertise. There's a lot of work being done by organisations like the IMF and others to try and improve risk assessment processes, which is important where you have limited resources. You need to be much more strategic and really focus on the taxpayers that present risk. However, there's still a lot more work to be done there, and there's still gradually building up, but more need for that. And outsourcing audits. So there are different views on this, of course, but there are countries, for example, Angola and Timor-Leste, that regularly outsource oil and gas audits to the Big Four and other audit firms. However, Ghana and Kenya in particular have notably not chosen that route, despite having the legal basis to do so in their model petroleum agreements. In Kenya's case, it has co-sourced expertise to also build capacity whilst doing the audit, the cost recovery audit, but this comes at a cost. Whereas in the model petroleum agreement, they have the right to request the oil and gas taxpayer to use an independent audit firm that they will pay for directly, that the government will approve. Kenya has chosen not to take that route and instead pay for that co-sourced audit expertise itself. And lastly, on transparency and public accountability. So none of the challenges that I mentioned previously are insurmountable. So governments can tackle them with a mix of policy, legal and administrative reforms. But of course it takes political will, and particularly there needs to be alignment of incentives. So we can see that all of these things can be addressed. It's a question of whether the government is willing to address them. Of course there are resource constraints. We're not denying that, but it really comes down to whether there is political will and leadership. And so there's a number of issues here: inadequate audit capacity, reluctance to invoke these third-party audits, etc. So why is that the case? Is it a lack of political will? Is it that there's a misalignment of incentives? So in Peru, for example, there was a comment that the government doesn't have any interest in auditing. That is akin to communism. I think also concerns around the business-friendly ethos more generally, with government involvement in securing oil and gas contracts. We mentioned the misalignment of incentives, and I think this is a question in Kenya where civil society has questioned whether the political imperative of producing early oil as soon as possible has led government to deprioritise cost audits. Why is it that we're only now in 2018, 10 years after the fact, why is it only now that the government is embarking on this process of auditing? Of course, there's always the concern about undue influence by companies, although rent-seeking wasn't directly observed in this research, but it can't be ruled out. So what do we do about this? Well, firstly, it's as we go back to the role of the Auditor General, so continuing efforts to strengthen our oversight actors and accountability and reporting. So what we noticed across all 3 countries is just a lack of public reporting on audits. And the new IMF Fiscal Transparency Code includes a basic requirement now for governments to publish a report on their audits, which is a great step, and I think Thomas will speak more about that. But this is an issue generally, is that it's a black box, essentially. We know that we have taxpayers, they have contracts, we know that revenues are being paid to government, but we have no idea whether those revenues are the right amount or not, and whether or not our governments are actually actively exercising their right to audit costs. So these are some of the issues that need to come out more clearly, and we need greater transparency around these so that citizens are actually in a position to hold their governments accountable with respect to cost auditing. So I'm not going to go through the recommendations because that's your homework to read the report. But I just want to draw your attention very quickly to, in the report towards the end, there is a checklist for monitoring cost audits. There's a lot of interest in this from civil society and other partners within the Oxfam network. And so we've highlighted there a number of indicators that civil society might look to when trying to determine whether their governments are actually auditing costs in the oil and gas sector. So thank you for allowing me a bit more time, and I hand back to Becca. Thank you.
So Alexandra, thank you so much for taking us through the report, but still giving us homework to do. That's very important. No such thing as a free reception here, guys. So I want to just frame really quickly, and as we really dig deeper into each of the case studies today, to really remember that we, as we work with different governments, they have the power and authority to actually know what these cost estimates are if they're able to use these tools of the audits more effectively, right? So we know we can do better collectively working with and within governments to do this. We have the power and the resources, and there's a roadmap for how to get there.